Thank you for downloading from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Support for this podcast comes from your generous gifts and donations. You can find out more about Ravi Zacharias and the team at www.rzim.org.
What's your typical worship service look like?
Dressed down, casual.
Jacket, dress shirt and a tie.
Contemporary music.
A cappella.
Speaking and shouting even. Drums.
Non-traditional. Traditional.
Welcome back to Just Thinking. There are two sides to every coin, and the arena of worship is the same way. On one side, we have those who endorse traditional forms of worship since that's always the way it's been. On the other side are those that proclaim their right to worship God in any way they please, without the restrictions of tradition or anything at all in some cases. In today's program, Ravi starts with a look at the traditionalists and moves on to look at their counterparts on the other side of the aisle. Let's listen.
Secondly, worship formatively becomes an error where obsolete forms may be used only because they are old. Older is better. See, the Catholic Church hit this head on and just about crucified themselves in the process. The Latin language, it was the saintly language. And they started losing their young people right, left, and center. The young person says, I don't even understand what is going on. Islam is running into this problem because Arabic is the only language for the Quran. And what has happened now is that the young people who don't understand Arabic, such as their converts in England, are running into a problem. You see, there's a very important tension here, and it's what I call the legitimacy of dialectic. There are two extremes. I remember speaking at our Fort Wayne Gospel Temple celebrating 50 years. And, Billy Graham candidated there, and he was turned down years ago. And they have the distinction of having turned him down for the pastorate there. Many of the great preachers in the Alliance have pastored there. Paul Edwardson was there, and several of the others were in that church. But interestingly, the whole service that I was there was a reflection on the past, and I found it fascinating. Billy Sunday had preached there. And they started to list the names of the speakers that had spoken in that church. And, my mind just... enormous thrill in something like that. I remember being at the NBC studios once where they were giving a lecture on Johnny Carson, and they said this is the star where he stands when he gives his monologue. And, when they asked for questions, everybody said, can we stand on that star for a moment? And I stood there and I said, good grief, I could hardly wait for my turn to go and stand on the star, But I'll tell you, when I went through East Germany, I sure wanted to step into the pulpits where Martin Luther had stood. And one young person came to me after that service there, and he said, I want to say something to you. He said, we've been doing this for 4 Sundays here. They've been having a different speaker. He said, and all I've been hearing for 4 weeks is what happened 50 years ago. And I said to him, look, I sympathize where you're coming from. I said, but don't ever forget that the only thing worse than nostalgia is amnesia. To have no memory at all is worse than going only to the past. And I said, and what they are doing is delivering you from your amnesia. I said, they're letting you know whence you came. So let's hold that in balance. Tradition does inform the church. After all, the Holy Spirit is not something brand new that has arrived in our generation. He has been speaking to generations gone by. But in communication, it is very important if we do not communicate idiomatically in a way that we can be understood. The third corruption in form. How many did I list for you here? I gave you 4. All right, I have several. I'll just touch 4. 3 is what I call where cultural influences are accepted as norm. And the question I ask, therefore, in this is just one question. Are all forms okay? There's one woman in our audience whom I went out for lunch with Joy Bays, and she looked at me and she said, "What you're telling me is this, that if I become a Christian, I give up my job." I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "As a teacher, I have to lead my children in Buddhist rites. And so you're telling me that I resign my job?" I said, "I am telling you this, that if God is who He claims to be, and He is speaking to you, your responsibility is to respond to Him. And if He has the power to save you, He can help you face your job and deal with the issues as they come one day at a time. And if it means abandoning your job, then He will give you the strength to deal with that." She said, "I'm not ready yet." This was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She said, "When's your next sermon?" I said, 3. She said, "I've got to go to a wedding at about 5:30. I said, "I'll be through by 4. She was there, and she was the first one to respond. And afterwards, she told Joy and Margie, she said, "I've taken a first step, and I have said to Jesus, if you really are who you claim to be, I'm willing to serve you. Just show yourself to me." Good enough, for a first step for a person coming from that kind of a Buddhist background. But my question is, are all forms all right? And we need to ask our young people that. At any point, does the form destroy the message? Suppose I say to my wife, "This is my way of loving you, whether you feel loved or not. I'm going to give you a Jim Reeves record for your birthday, whether you like Jim Reeves or not, because I do like him." At that point, has the form become sovereign over substance? And we need, particularly for our young generation, to keep harnessing this in their minds, that just because culturally I find this nice does not mean all forms are all right. Sometimes they are vestiges of a different substance. Number 4, forms, I think, become spurious when they force us to pretend that things are not the way they really are. For example, for me to stand up and sing, and He walks with me and talks with me and tells me that I am His own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. To sing it while I don't even have a devotional life is a spurious. If our hymnology were our theology, I think we'd run into problems. Because experientially, sometimes it just does not measure up. Now, please bear in mind, I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying a form becomes dangerous. Sometimes we are forced to say things and do things that may not be very real to our own experience. And we conjure up emotion in an effort to sustain essence. If you clap loud enough and hard enough and strong enough, you will become happy whether you are happy or not. You see, so we take the form and force it into an existence here. Now, please listen to this argument very, very carefully. There is a sense in which Jesus is there to contradict us. In other words, if I come into a worship service and find it irrelevant, then I have to ask myself one question. Is it because God is irrelevant to me, or I am irrelevant to God? What is the reason for this irrelevance? Is the irrelevance that my life is not measuring up? Or is the irrelevance the fact that somehow God doesn't seem to have a vital place in my life? See, Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. And He compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way He encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived Him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. And so Jesus had to stop the disciples and say, "Look, boys, don't weep for me. Women, don't weep for me, because I've never been more alive than I am now. But weep for yourselves and your children, because this generation is the dead generation." What do I mean by this? Suppose I were to come in feeling very badly that I had a bad day at work yesterday or something, and that maybe would like to have seen better income. And I sit in the room there, the sanctuary there, and the pastor is preaching on the refugee problem of the world. And I say, wait a minute, I came here with enough problems, you're dumping one more on me. That's a good question. Maybe I am intended to be lifted beyond my own little world. and look at a world that is much larger than mine. That is what I call the contradiction of Christ. Follow what I'm saying. It is not as though I have to change God to appeal to me. It is what I have to do is to ask God's help to change me so I am relevant to what He is saying. This is the challenge of the leader in worship every Sunday morning, and that's why it's so hard. There are parameters. You see, this is so clear in the Old Testament, where God actually takes over 10 chapters to dictate the design of the tabernacle. Now, don't tell me God didn't have more important things to do with Moses. All He could have said to Moses was, gather for a place for me to worship. But you see, today, for example, we do not send our church leaders to Sinai to get a description for our next building. And the reason we don't do that is because in those days, they went to the sanctuary. These days, we take the sanctuary with us. So when 400 people come to worship, they are really not coming to the sanctuary, but 400 sanctuaries are coming into a building to worship. Which means, if it was so important to God how the tabernacle was kept and what was in it, it is equally important to God how this temple is maintained and what is in it. For this is where I truly worship with Him now. And if somebody comes to me and says, I'm free to choose any way I want, this is where the charismatic movement, when it's taken to an extreme, commits suicide.
Another reminder of why we need to be on our guard at all times to make sure that our worship is truly directed towards God. You've been listening to the continuation of Ravi's series on Leadership and Worship. Order this message or others by calling us at 1-800-448-6766. You can also order on our website at rzim.org or rzim.ca for those listening in Canada.
Welcome to the RZIM Academy Core Module. This is a training program for helping people to become more effective in pointing people to Jesus Christ. The assignments and approach that we're using is drawn from the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. We want you to get to know each other and learn from one another as you go through the course together. This isn't an academic course on answering questions or responding to objections. This is the best way to grow. As you go through this course, you become better equipped to reach out to the people around you and have enjoyable, meaningful conversations with them about Jesus.
This is the task of Christian apologetics, whether it be in debate, whether it be in argument, whether it be in defense, whether it be in confirmation. It is ultimately to present the person of Jesus Christ and who He is. It is to enable you to be more effective communicators of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Register at rzimacademy.org.
Statistics and surveys show that many young people walk away from their faith during their college years. These students are often confused and disappointed that no one addresses their honest questions and doubts. At RZIM, we prioritize reaching colleges and universities, and we hope that you will consider partnering with us as we strive to reach the younger generation. Learn more by calling us or visiting our website. Just Thinking is a listener-supported radio ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.